I will start sharing your screen. Or my screen, I guess. So welcome everybody. Today's session is called Navajo Peacemaking and Indigenous Restorative Justice Practice with Paulina Whitehead. And this is being put on by the National American Indian and Alaska Native Childhood Trauma Center TSA Category 2, as well as the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network K-12 School Mental Health Program. Just a quick couple of things. The National American Indian and Alaska Native Childhood Trauma Treatment Service and Adaptation Center and the National American Indian and Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center K-12 School Mental Health Program are supported by a grant from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is SAMHSA. And the content of this event is the creation of the presenters, and the opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or the NCTSN. Just to kind of get it started, we have our land acknowledgement for the Native Center for Behavioral Health. If you feel comfortable, please take a moment to read through, and then we will get started on introductions. And if you feel comfortable, please feel free to introduce yourself, where you're from and where you work in the chat. We'd love to see people actively participate in our sessions. I'm going to give everyone a couple, like 30 more seconds, and then we'll move on. So just some brief follow-up. Following today's event, you'll receive a follow-up email, which will include the link of the presentation slides, as well as the recording. It'll be on our YouTube, the Native Center for Behavioral Health. And then any resources or links that are discussed will be shared in the chat box as well, and a link to our evaluation survey. You should also see in about the last 20 minutes of the session, our link to our evaluation survey. Please, if you have time, click that. It should take about 2 to 3 minutes. And with that, we have my introduction. So my name is Liz Sadoff. I am the program coordinator for the National American Indian and Alaska Native Childhood Trauma Center. I'm a graduate of the Masters of Public Health program in Community and Behavioral Health with a focus on health equity from the University of Iowa. And I also have a public health degree and a writing certificate. And then with that, I'm going to hand it off to our wonderful program manager for the K-12 program, Kevin.
Well, hi, I'm everyone. Kevin Simmons, Naga Yafo, Naga Chagu Kobo, Grand Round, Oregon, the Muckleshoot, Washington. Hello, my name is Kevin Simmons. I'm from Grand Round, Oregon, and Muckleshoot, Washington. I am the manager of the K-12 School Mental Health Program for the National American Indian Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. We're excited and we welcome everybody here today. We're excited about the content as well as our presenter. Before we get started, we wish to acknowledge all of those who had a hand in helping us put this program together, not only the administrative staff at the center, but also our graduate research assistants, which are also full-time students as well too. We wouldn't be able to bring these types of efforts to folks and to Indian country if it wasn't for our GRAs and our wonderful staff of support at the national centers. And with that, I would like to introduce our colleague and our presenter here today, Dr. Paulina Whitehead. Diné is a citizen of the Navajo Nation of Northern Arizona. She is a research associate in the Center of Equity and Promotion in the College of Education at the University of Oregon, where she earned a PhD in Special Education and Political Sciences. She worked with the Northwest Indian Language Institute to develop and provide professional development for classroom teachers and school administrators regarding educational policy and native language revitalization. Her research is focused on redressing the effects of adverse events so that individuals with and without disabilities have opportunities to experience academic, professional, and personal success and positively contribute to their community. The primary focus of our work is on affecting educational policies and countering the effects of poverty, disability, and trauma experienced by Indigenous students and other individuals who are historically underrepresented in school settings. In addition to being an esteemed scholar, Dr. Whitehead is also a colleague of mine who I can personally testify that she has helped me in my own personal educational journey by just providing and being a good human. And so with that, I introduce everyone to Dr. Paulina Whitehead. Thank you, Paulina.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you for that very kind introduction, Kevin. I am thankful to be here. I'm thankful for this opportunity to share some knowledge that I've gained from working with students, from colleagues and relatives and many mentors that I have met in my journey. So I'm very excited to share about Navajo peacemaking to this afternoon with you. So it's good to be here. And I would like to welcome all of you and thank you for taking time to be here today. So I'm going to attempt to share my slides. I always have some trouble sometimes. And can everybody see my screen?
Yep, you have it shared perfectly.
Okay. So for those of you who would like to reach out, my email address is on this title page. And today I'm going to be sharing some information about Navajo peacemaking, and it's an Indigenous restorative justice practice. So first I wanted to introduce myself again, and this time I'm going to do this in Diné Bikéyah, the Navajo language, for my Dinette relatives who are in the audience and who will be listening to this session. Yat Shea Paulina Whitehead and Shea Tlana Kinlachi Ninchlo, Eshihi Bashashin, Ye Dinette Tachi Dashache, Todaji Dashanale, Tlachi has Kanaholiete e Aisi Nasha, E Ade Eshi to Adashitiche, Adeya Organ de Nashnesh. The Ekut out the nest on the Nishle. So I just shared that my clans for my Navajo relatives that are out there, and then also that's one of the practices that we do to identify ourselves to other Dinette in the audience in case we're related or we're relatives. And I'm also a fluent speaker of the Nebizad, and I currently reside in Oregon. So I'm going to share a little bit of my research interests. I'm really interested in improving education for Native students. And I'm not just talking about educational outcomes. I'm talking about the experience that Native students have in school so that they feel like they're welcome in that school space, and also so they feel like they belong, because we are on Native lands anywhere we are in the United States and also in North America. And so our students should feel welcome and feel like they belong when they're at school. So a lot of my research interests have to do with affecting educational policies, and then also any policies encountering the effects of poverty and adversity that are experienced by students. And right now, I'm really focused on developing and implementing interventions to build capacity for trauma responsive and trauma healing practices in school systems and also in communities. And some of my research has been on reducing teacher burnout and also reducing teacher stress for teachers and other school personnel who work with students in the schools. So overall, I'm focused on improving wellness and mental health for students as well as school staff and other personnel in school settings. I was going to say, please bear with me. I have had a very bad cold last week and my throat is kind of recovering. So I might cough sometimes when I don't mean to. So, um, so some of the, so trauma could come up in conversations when and discussions during like peacemaking and other restorative practices. And so I'm just going to, so SAMHSA has a definition about the concept of trauma, where it could be like an event or a series of events. And then there's, and then thinking about that experience or those experiences and these experiences and events could have long lasting and adverse effects on a person, on their mental health. And then I have some examples here, how this could show up and what it could look like. And then also in an effort to have organizations be using trauma-informed approaches, there's the 4 Rs of trauma-informed approaches. Just making sure that an organization or a program realizes the widespread impact of trauma, and then understanding the potential paths for recovery, and then also recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients and other people that are involved in the system. And that could include personnel as well. And then also part of the approaches is responding to the trauma and making sure that the response are reflected in policies, procedures, and also practices. And then also the last R is just resisting re-traumatizing those people who've experienced trauma. So being sensitive and mindful that about this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just kind of a broad overview of restorative justice. The use of restorative justice practices helps to reduce serious incidents, violence, and bullying. It also could improve youth behavior. It could strengthen civil society, provide effective leadership, restore relationships, and also repair harm. And then some of the responses to harm are restoration, accountability, and engagement. And these responses are built on the values of respect, responsibility, and then also relationships. Then I found these words, and they mean a lot. And it's those people who are in the healing journey. Like, healing doesn't mean that the damage never existed. It means that the damage no longer controls our lives. And I thought those were some very powerful words that, everybody has experienced some adversity in their lives, and just learning to cope with that, healing from that, and then making sure that it no longer controls our thoughts and our bodies and our responses, and just learning to cope with it. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about Indigenous peoples have been practicing restorative justice practices since time immemorial. It's part of Indigenous culture, and it's practiced by Indigenous peoples all over the world. And here I have a picture of, on the left, a picture of an old photograph of a talking circle, and that's Kicking Bear addressing people at the Pine Ridge Agency in 1891. And the way talking circles were done, people talk one at a time and also listen to the person that's talking, and the person that's talking chooses their words carefully, and they think about what they're going to share with the group, and usually they're selected for their oral skills and selected by their community to speak for them. So that's kind of an example of what's happening. And then on the right is a symbol of peace and confederacy. This is a picture of the wampum belt um, that was used by the Haudenosaunee people from the southeast, and the wampum belt is a symbol of peace. It's a symbol of confederacy, and just people. It led to the foundations, to the formation of the United States, and as well as the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So it's a symbol of how we can conduct ourselves in a civil way and get along with each other. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about Navajo peacemaking, and Navajo peacemaking comes from, its practice on Diné Bikéyah. It comes from Dinette. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where Navajo peacemaking is practiced and where it comes from. So here I have a map of Diné Bikéyah, which is in the Four Corners region of the United States, and it spans Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some places on the map. So first, here is Tepeta'a, and it's known as Shiprock. It's in New Mexico. Next on the map is Tselahotsa, known as Window Rock, and it's in Arizona. It's the capital of the Navajo Nation, and it's where a lot of our tribal government offices are located. And then next is Tsei, known as Canyon de Shea. It's also in Arizona. And Tsei is one of the sacred places. It's where our Dinette, our deities, they live in the canyon, and that's where a lot of them live. And then next, I have a picture of Doko Asleep, the San Francisco Peaks. It's one of our sacred mountains, and it's the sacred mountain of the western direction, and it's near Flagstaff. And then next, I have a picture of Tsepitinziskwe, which is known as Monument Valley, and that's located in southern Utah. So this is just to give you an idea of where the idea of Navajo peacemaking comes from and where it's practiced. So next, I'm going to give a little bit of information about the background and the context for Navajo peacemaking. Navajo peacemaking was a means of dispute resolution for the Dinette before Huelde, and that's the long walk of the Navajo in 1864. And so before settler colonialism, prevention was very key in the teaching and training of Dinette children. And so, for an example, everyone in the family, the relatives in an individual's clan participated in the upbringing of children. So traditional child rearing and prevention practices. So these practices, they were hindered by historical trauma, forced assimilation, PTSD, and intergenerational stress. And they were also further hindered by excuse me, by forced assimilation by the US government. And, and the government attempted to destroy the Diné way of life. And those efforts are ongoing in current times. Like, for example, in current times, Diné youth are attracted to the dominant American culture. They're influenced by pop culture, technology, um, social media, and cultural forces. And sometimes their interests get out of balance and don't make a lot of time for culture, language, and um, Diné knowledge and other practices that are really important to know as a Diné person. So these factors make prevention efforts and practicing cultural teachings challenging because they're always there, and as anybody who's worked with youth know, they're always connected and they're on some kind of device, and so it's very challenging. But with working with youth, like what their if you know what their interests are and what they're interested in, you can engage them. And some of the success comes with reclaiming and revitalizing cultural knowledge and practices with children. And especially when parents and families have strong family ties and they know their relationships, they know their kinship. And if they have like strong traditional language background, as well as practicing culture, and then just different stages of learning the language, reclaiming the language, and practices. Um, so Navajo peacemaking was reintroduced in 1982. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this is kind of like my concept of what um, the Navajo peacemaking process and component looks like. So some of the main components are like the peacemaking usually begins with a dispute. Um, in the Navajo language, we call it a nahoti. And then when a formal like peacemaking um, session begins, it begins with a prayer, sotezin, so that things will go well and that the conflict would be resolved in a good way. And then next in the process is the dispute resolution, where things are talked out. And then during the session, the net teachings are shared, and some of the current situation at hand could be related to the net creation stories, and then finding like when this happened, according to our creation stories, kind of relating to that to the situation at hand, and then kind of seeing some of the knowledge and the teachings that come out of that. And then next in the process is reconciliation. And this includes restoration, resolution, or I'm sorry, restitution, and in the Nepazad we call Naliye could also be involved here. And the goal is to reach Hózhó, or harmony, so that there's some kind of balance and there's some kind of peace, and people can continue to have good relationship with each other, and then also, go about in a peaceful way. And some of the other components that are involved are leadership, not ani, prevention, the cultural teachings, the language, the family ties, and ke, as well as Diné knowledge, like relying on Navajo fundamental laws, the wisdom, the methods, different customs, and then also and then of course Hózhó, the state of balance or harmony, is what 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 the goal is and what we're striving for. So a lot of this process, there's a focus on the individuals that are involved in the situation. So I'm going to share a quote by the Honorable Robert Yazzie. He says the Western law is to punish you so that you don't repeat the behavior, but the Navajo way is to focus on the individual. You have to separate the action from the person. So when you're dealing with situation in any setting, remember to focus on the individual and separate that action from the person, because the action is not the person. So we want to focus on seeing what's going on with the individual and offer them some support. Um, and then this could be like the person who's doing the offending or the person that was offended, the, the victim in the situation. So there's some different, and it's good to consider that there's differences in ideas of justice between like the Western um, the Western ways of dealing with different incidents, and then there's the restorative process. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but I'm just going to pick out a couple of of things that are really really different. Um, so first, like with the restorative process, the problem solving is centered, and then with the retributive process, the blame fixing is centered. And then another difference would be that the victim and the offender are informed during the process. And then in the retributive process, um, there's usually information lacking, and usually the victim lacks information. And the offender may not really know what's happening because they use languages that they're not familiar with. And, you know, sometimes they don't understand what that means. And then with the restorative process, there's a possibility of a win-win um, situation. Whereas with the retributive process, um, there's usually like a win and a lose situation. So next, I'm going to talk about the different components of peacemaking. So one of them I mentioned before is Hózhó. Um, so the whole idea is to achieve Hózhó, or harmony and balance. And then also, not only do you achieve it, but then you got to maintain it. And there's ongoing maintenance of being in balance. So once you get in balance, get back in balance, it has to be maintained, and that takes some work and it takes some effort. And then another component to think about is respect. And this is a photograph of the Honorable Robert Yazzie, and he was really instrumental in bringing Navajo peacemaking back to the Navajo tribal courts as an avenue to resolve situations or disputes, rather than just sticking with one option, which is like through the judicial system, through the traditional courts. He thought there would be better to have a different avenue, especially when there's family situations, like restoring that harmony so that people can, especially families, restoring families and keeping, and then the other piece too was keeping the offenders in the community so they're not sent away or sent out somewhere else. So he says that the peacemaking process is related to the concept of k'eh, or respect. K'eh means to restore my dignity, and it means to restore my worthiness. So no matter what someone has done, no matter what kind of harm that they've done, you know, that person is worthy of restoring. And it kind of goes along with the idea of that many Indigenous peoples consider the youth, um, they're the future generation, and view them as a resource, and they're one of the most valuable resources in their community. So it's worth taking time to restore them, like see what's going on with them and help them, rather than just get rid of them or throw them away like unfortunately it happens sometimes. And the other thing about respect is one should treat their relatives well. Treat people as if they are your relative. And this is and that was one of the lessons that I learned from Shimasana, my maternal grandmother. Sh- She taught me to always be respectful to people and respect people, because she's like, you never know who's your relative or who could become your relative in the future. So always having that respect for people wherever you go. And then another component is leadership. Um, like traditionally, clan leaders were selected by relatives or community members or people in their clan. And we call our leaders Not Ani. So there are peacemaking Not Ani, and they are selected by the community. And so in each community, there's somebody that speaks well, that people um, feel like they respect and hold in high regards, that can speak for them, that know the different creation stories, that know the language, that know the culture, the practices, and even know the people in the community. And, these people want um, their community to have some peace so that people can get along and remain in the community. And then another component is prevention. Um, so practicing the Dinette way of being daily, whether that means like getting up each morning and greeting the day with an offering and asking for a good day, and then doing the same at dusk. And so it just looks different depending on how much culture is practiced in the family. And then also being respectful of that too. If you're not familiar with Indigenous practices, know that Indigenous peoples, from different areas, different communities have different practices, and always be respectful of what they're doing and the way that they show their spirituality. And then in this case, like Dinette teachings and training of children, like learning the clans, learning how to be respectful, um, collective upbringing of children. And this means like, treating your siblings' children like your own children, treating, just the children in the family like they're our children. We're responsible for them, and we want them to go out in the world and be the best person that they can be. And the same thing with when you work with youth, like we're invested in the youth. And this is what I want the youth to go away with. These are the teachings um, that we want them to have, and any skills that they can use now and then also in the future. And then this could look like using kinship terms, and I'll touch on that in a little bit, what that looks like for Dinette. So this is kind of an overview of the Dinette clan system, and this is what I meant by the kinship. Um, Kinship, we call this Ke, and it's a system of respect, and then Ke also establishes relationships. And from what I know, there's over 30 kinship terms. So an individual has a term for every relation that they have in their family. And the Diné used the matrilineal clan system. And this means that an individual belongs to their mother's clan. And from my research, um, it was mentioned that there's over 210 clans, and these clans are grouped into about 21 different groups. And then in this diagram, I have like the different, and the net individual has 4 clans, and one is their maternal clan, their mother's clan, and then the paternal clan, the father's clan, the paternal grandfather's clan, which is your father's father's clan, the maternal grandfather's clan, and your mother's father's clan. And if anyone's familiar with when Dinette people introduce themselves, we usually state our 4 clans. And so this is to know, like, to let other people know who you are, what clan you come from, in case to establish, some kind of relationship with other people. And I know that other Indigenous peoples use kinship systems too. So if you work with Indigenous peoples, like, kind of get an idea of what their kinship looks like or what it sounds like and what kids know. And if kids are not familiar with that, um, that could be like a learning, something that they could learn. Um, Another component is Diné knowledge. Um, so the use of Diné knowledge in the peacemaking process or any restorative practice. And this should be something that's integrated in daily life and daily business. And some examples of Diné knowledge are the Navajo fundamental laws, which is used a lot. A lot of our policies and practices on Diné Bikéyah are based on the Navajo fundamental laws, the wisdom that comes from our ancestors, different various methods and customs. And some of the methods have been adapted um, to current times and new technology. And then so next I have share the Diné philosophy of learning. And this is like a really, so this is kind of using that Diné knowledge to in a in the peacemaking process, and the peacemaking process uses that the Diné philosophy of learning. So the parts I'm going to really talk about is the thinking piece, and we call that nsahakis. So really thinking about that everyone's thinking about what the outcome is going to be, and preparations and plans, and thinking about like what the vision is. So having a vision and kind of working towards that vision or that mission, and having those goals, like thinking about how you're going to reach your goals. And then another piece is the planning, and we call that nahata. So the development of goals to fulfill a certain purpose. So in this case, talking about Navajo peacemaking would be to plan to come to some kind of peace, and how is that going to be reached, and thinking about all the different components that are needed to reach that healing, that restoration, and turning things around. And then the other piece is the living ina, and that's kind of like looking at reflecting on what's going on, um, always adding to your knowledge, so adding to that continuous learning. And then the other component is the assuring component. Sihasin is reflecting on what's been accomplished so far. Do we need to revisit certain aspects of this process? Do we need to adapt it? And just thinking about all the objectives and the outcomes, like what needs to be adapted, and if something needs to be addressed, just reflecting on that, and then the process kind of starts all over. And this is not just used for Navajo peacemaking, but it's used usually in education to think about things that involve the community. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about the process. So usually there's a dispute, and then a peacemaking session usually begins with a prayer. Usually dispute resolution usually happens. Dinette teachings are shared. There's a reconciliation, and then hopefully the goal is reached, which is to have some peace and reach Hózhó. So I'm going to talk about these in a little bit more detail. Usually with the way the peacemaking works is usually the process begins with some kind of a dispute. and the Halti. And then in the way the court systems use this, there's usually like a referral to the peacemaking court, or somebody usually makes like a self-referral. And then some of the questions that really should be pondered and thought about during this process is, and then also with the Navajo peacemaking, some of the questions to think about is, and then these questions also need to be addressed. Like think about like who has been harmed in this situation, and what are their needs, and whose obligation are these? And how do we collectively work together to make things right? So I know that there's in the audience, there's different people from different organizations, maybe not necessarily school settings, but various organizations. Like those are some questions to think about and adapt like this practice to your organization, since you're the experts and you know your organization and you know your clients. Like maybe start thinking about how to see if your organization addresses any of these questions, like thinking about the needs of um, of the different people that are involved. Um, like what kind of resources do they need? What kind of support do they need? And whose obligations are those? Um, getting the family involved, getting the community involved, and who can you work with collectively to make sure that these that the people involved have the supports that they need. So then, like I mentioned before, the process involves a prayer. So the Zen, and the session usually begins with a prayer, and this is to ask our and Dinette, who we pray to, for assistance with the dispute, so that there's good outcomes, and so that we achieve some peace, and that people will remain in the community, and that people will achieve healing, that their needs would be addressed. So asking for all of that for assistance, because we can only do so much, and we can ask the Creator and our Dinette and deities, whomever we pray to, for assistance during this process. And then, so the next piece is, or the next in the process, is the dispute resolution. This is where the offender and the victim, they share their feelings usually, and then they also share the impact of the offender's conduct, like what has happened and how it's impacted them, and really sharing like what that looks like with examples. And then also relatives and other people in the community can share too. And then during this time, sometimes there's excuses that come out, usually by the offender. In psychology, that's referred to as the cognitive dissonance. Um, and usually, and it's because the person that's doing the offender or doing the offending, um, they're basically like told, like they're confronted that what you've done has really made an impact on me, and it's usually in a negative way, and usually that doesn't sit well with them. So they're going to be like, coming up with excuses, and this is why I did this, and this, like kind of giving you the different um like what's going on. And then this is a time to clarify attributional errors, like verify who did what to whom and why. So kind of like untangling all of this information, like what exactly happened, and what happened, and to whom did it happen, and why did it happen. And then this is where a lot of the um, sharing of perception happens. And then other people who are impacted by by this harm, by this offense or the incident, usually are welcome to share as well. So there's a lot of heavy feelings and people talking about their feelings or things that have happened. And so, you know, it's just kind of really heavy, and it's time to really to see what really get to like what's happening, and that takes time. And then also, that was the one thing I forgot to mention earlier, is that this whole process takes time. It's not going to be something that's going to get addressed in 50 minutes or in 2 hours. It could take all day. It could take a couple of days, depending on how complex the situation is. So making time to really get to what's going on, that there needs to be time that's carved out for that. And then also making sure that people feel safe, and there's a sense of trust, that people that you trust are there, people that make you feel safe are there, and that people are making that space a safe place to share, and that there's a lot of trust and, you know, time for some healing to take place. And then sometimes people might be reluctant to share because maybe there's some shame in what's happened or how something made them feel. And then these are some questions that come up, like for the victim, for family members, friends of the victim and the offender, and also for the offender. Like for the victim, um, you know, there's questions like, what did you think when you realized what happened? What impact has the incident had on you and others? And what has been the hardest thing for you? What do you think needs to happen to make things right? So usually asking the victim, like, what could make things right, because they know um, what could make them feel better, what would, you know, what needs to happen to move on and to heal. And then also asking like family members and friends um, just different questions to clarify things about the incident or the dispute, and then also to share their perspectives and their effect on them, because one incident, you know, has, it affects others too, especially when there's family and friends involved. And then also questions for the offender, like asking them what happened and what were you thinking about at the time? What have you thought about since? And who has been affected by what you've done? And what do you think needs to happen to make things right? And usually the offender will have an idea, like about what they've done and what they're capable of um, in order to make things right. And that's when um, people who are supporting or people who work with with youth especially know, like, when there's needed support. Maybe there needs to be some emotional regulation that needs to happen. Um, maybe just some people might need help processing like what happened, especially what happens when you do something to someone. So a lot of going back to the basics of human behavior. And then back to the Dinette teachings part, which is part of the process. Um, in this case, applying Dinette values, um, attribution, reassignment, um, and then sometimes like some of our creation stories and some of our stories that we all grew up with hearing and thinking about how they relate to the current issue, and like thinking about how that, like certain dispute, um, how that was resolved, and can that be applied to this situation? So just applying like what those indigenous values that people know. So next in the process is reconciliation, um, also some restoration from restitution and nollie. And this is where the relationship is repaired or the beginnings of repairing a relationship. And then some kind of reparation to the victim. And this could be like an item. I know historically, Dinette, we use like jewelry or livestock as nalye, as a reparation to the victim. And then also in current days, this could look like receiving some kind of treatment, whether it's Western or traditional. That could be like counseling, mental health services, behavioral health services, just different kinds of treatment. And sometimes the treatment could look like a ceremony. Maybe a ceremony is offered by the relatives, like the person needs to go to ceremony and come back into balance. And our relatives know that when a person is out of balance, and when we have respect for our relatives and they know what works, they know what's best for us, and they know what we're missing. So they're hopefully will have their support, gain their support if you don't have it, and have those people that care about the both parties that are involved, so that because they have an investment and they know what's going to help either party in this situation. And then the goal, if everything has been addressed, there's going to be the goal of reaching Hózhó, the end goal, where the dispute is settled and going back to have some peace, which means having good relations. The relationships are in solidarity. That's what it could look like, and everything is in its proper place, and people are relating well to each other, and things are working again. So that's what we want to reach, and where people are getting along, and there's some sense of balance and harmony. So these are some considerations to think about while you're using some kind of either Navajo peacemaking or a similar practice. So some of the things that, like I said, determine suitability, like determining like what works for your organization, what needs to be adapted. So first, one of the most important things is suitability. Does this practice, is it going to work for your group, for your program, for your organization? So this includes assessing the process for appropriateness for a condition or a situation, and also looking to see if the parties agree to participate. So this one's specific to Navajo peacemaking. Are the facilitators available and prepared? Does the condition or the issue fit the time required for the process? And then can the participants remain physically and emotionally safe? So again, making sure that that we're trauma responsive, and making sure that people feel safe, and either physically or emotionally, spiritually. And then the preparation for the peacemaking, planning it, the setup, making sure that there's enough staff, and then other logistics too, like time, place, making sure that people have some water, some food to eat, those kind of things. And then think about who needs to participate, and think about who has the necessary information, and who has the skills and the knowledge to help, and what is the context of the issues at hand. And then convene all the parties, like the contact is conducted within the circle. So identify like the shared values and the guidelines, share concerns and goals, share feelings, probe for underlying conflict and causes for harm, determine consensus for action, making sure everybody's on the same page and they're ready to take action, and then also creating agreements and also clarifying like some of the responsibilities that were agreed to during the session. And then follow-up is also very important. Um, so this might mean assessing progress on agreements, and then checking to see if the obligations are being met. And then also, if they're not being met, like having some practices or procedures in place to make sure that that the obligations are being met, and maybe checking to see why there's that it's not happening. So probe for causes of failures or delays, and then reestablish and identify steps to get back on track. So if things are not on track, checking so that it can be back on track. And then there's always adjustments that need to be made. Sometimes adjustments are needed, and they could be based on developments as they arise. And then really important, celebrate and reward like any success that happens. So it's important because, celebrate those and recognize those successes that come out of this. And then the application of Navajo peacemaking, it can be used in schools to respond to truancy or disciplinary incidents. And some of it includes like serious incidents that could involve violence. It can be used as a prevention strategy with primary, middle, or high school students. Then also use an affective statement when a student has misbehaved. And for example, you could say something like this: when you disrupt the class, I feel sad or disrespected or disappointed. In hearing this, the student can learn how his or her behavior is affecting others. And this kind of goes along with like if you're an educator or like any space, just having those procedures in place. So having this be part of the procedures that is practiced daily, so kids recognize it and they know what's happening when this is brought up. And then there's also room to adapt the restorative questions. For example, you could adapt like, what do you think, or who do you think has been affected by what you just did? Like asking the person who's doing the offending, or and follow up with like, how do you think they've been affected? Because sometimes our youth don't really think about like, they might make quick decisions without really thinking about like what's going to happen, what kind of effect it has on others. So having them stop and think about those kind of in those situations, have them stop and think. So systematic use of restorative practices has a cumulative impact. It creates a restorative environment that fosters awareness, empathy, and responsibility, which is more effective in achieving social discipline than current reliance on punishment and sanctions. So I think just talking things out and seeing what is going on, rather than just like quickly responding with punishments and sanctions. Kids don't respond well to that. So so the most critical function of restorative practices is restoring and building relationships. And by encouraging people to express their feelings, restorative practices build better relationships. So before I go on to the next part, I've been participating in, or some of my research has to do with that I'm working on currently, is checking to see if if Native students are being disciplined disproportionately in K-12 schools here in the state of Oregon. And so we've heard, from students, from their families, from tribal community members, and we've also heard from like the school personnel and district personnel, and we've yet to analyze that data. But I think just kind of listening to what people have shared, what is really important is that when working with Native students, that one of the best thing that people can do, whether it's educators or other people who work with Native youth, is to invest time in building positive relationships with Native students. So when you have a positive relationship with your students, it builds trust, and they feel like, you can listen, that you're listening to them. They feel heard, and then they could share stuff with you, like this happened because like this other thing happened, and then you realize like there's, what situation that student is, and most of the time that student might just come up, and because they, will only see that person, and if you don't have a good relationship with your students, like you might, see them through a different set of lenses. But once you start investing in those positive relationships, you're going to see like a whole different side to your students, and they're going to share stuff with you and like tell you like this is happening, and this is why this happened. And sometimes they might tell you, I feel bad about that this happened. And then if you ask them like, how can we make this right, they're going to tell you like this can make it right. um, so just, if you can, invest that time in building relationships with Native students, and also making time too, like all this, the peacemaking, it takes time. And if you're thinking about adopting this practice, um, just make sure that there's time, that it's not going to be something that's going to be done overnight, making sure you have the right um, human capital for it, and that people understand the way it works and they respect the process. So some more questions to consider, and these are some things that you can put in the chat in a little bit, um, if you feel like sharing. Some questions for you to consider, like after listening to this about Navajo peacemaking. Um, these are some thoughts, like what are we restoring youth or people to when we consider the use of restorative practices? So basically, what are we restoring people to when we say restorative practices? Then another question to think about is, and what does this look like for Indigenous peoples? And remember that the Indigenous peoples um, are very diverse, live in different regions, and then live in different areas. Some live in rural areas, some live in urban areas, and then also suburban areas. So just different people, Native peoples live in different areas, very diverse. And then also think about, what does this look like for non-Indigenous peoples? So if you also work with non-Indigenous youth, what does this look like for them? And how are they going to receive it? And then this is one of the questions too, to really think about, what attributes of Navajo peacemaking do you think are effective for dispute resolution in non-Diné communities? So how will this work in a non-Diné community? Like what pieces or what aspects of it? And then another question, what components of peacemaking can be applied to the human services for example, education, counseling, any kind of family services. Okay, I'm going to look at a couple of what people have shared in the chat. I see a comment that says that entire school systems rooted in Indigenous practices, not just programs or pictures on our wall or few teachers here and there. And that's very, very true. Not just taking some components of it. Yeah, that has been some of my critique working, like being a scholar in a very white space, is that people take Indigenous restorative practices and adapt it, and they say it's a program or it's this, but it's like, no, the whole system has to be practicing it. It can't just be something that's practiced at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It has to be the entire day. So making room for that, making time for that, and investing in it, subscribing to Indigenous practices, that it's a whole knowledge system and not just like taking pieces that work for an organization. Okay, and I also see another comment that says the idea of kinship, looking at youth as relatives rather than cases or clients. Yes, thank you for sharing that, Alicia. I'm Good Soldier from Phoenix. That was something that I was humbled by and learned while I was an educator um, with the Oglala Lakota people on Pine Ridge in South Dakota. I taught at Little Wound School in Kyle, South Dakota, and some of my students were relatives of these world-known chiefs and leaders that are known around the world, and like American Horse or Little Wound or Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and so many other numerous leaders that that the students in my class in the school, those are their relatives, and the world knows who these leaders are. And just I had to really humble myself knowing that these are their relatives that I'm teaching, that I'm serving. So really seeing our youth, that our youth are, their ancestors were, great people that had many, many skills, whether it's leadership or um, knowledge keepers in their communities. So treat them with respect, and sometimes non-Indigenous peoples or even Indigenous peoples don't respect Indigenous youth and don't see them as our relatives. Treat them as relatives with respect. And sometimes, so many times, there's that throwaway mentality that, they're not complying and they're not doing what I want them to do. So, just throw them away from the system, from the school, and then also, which leads to exclusionary practices. And that's not something we want to do. We want to keep our children close and we want them to succeed. So having that, seeing the youth as our relatives, that's one thing that I would like to see that happen everywhere. And this leads me to kind of like closing, and then if there's any questions or comments, and maybe looking at some more of what's been shared in the chat. I haven't done that, but just kind of ending on this note about incorporating some Indigenous knowledge, wisdom, and just sharing the seventh generation prophecy by Kashunka Whitco, known as Crazy Horse, who was an Agolala Lakota. And he was born around 1840, and he lived until about 1877 when he was murdered in Nebraska, in present-day Nebraska. In his words, I was reading in my reading group recently, Duran, and he's talking about healing Indigenous peoples and working with Indigenous peoples. And so this was kind of a reminder for me, and then also a nod to the Lakota people who I've learned so much from. And I'm going to share his prophecy, and it has to do with Navajo peacemaking. So he says, upon suffering beyond suffering, the red nation shall rise again, and it shall be a blessing for a sick world, a world filled with broken promises, selfishness, and separations, a world longing for light again. I see a time of 7 generations when all the colors of mankind will gather under the sacred tree of life, and the whole earth will become one circle again. In that day, there will be those among the Lakota who will carry knowledge and understanding of unity among all living things, and the young white ones will come to those of my people and ask for this wisdom. So I was thinking about applying this to Navajo peacemaking and other Indigenous restorative practices. Like those practices were practiced by our ancestors, and we need to reclaim them and use them to help our youth, because I think we've tried the Western ways, those clinical ways. Sometimes they don't work for us. They don't work for our people. They don't work for our youth. And kind of going back to reclaiming and using our ancestral knowledge, like it worked. We come from great people who knew what worked. We come from healers. And I always tell people that before colonization here in the United States, and especially like my knowledge of Dinette, there were not prisons, there were no jails, there were not mental health institutions, there was no juvenile detention centers. It's because we took care of each other. We shared that knowledge. We invested in our youth. We listened to each other. We resolved disputes using our cultural knowledge, by using kinship, treating each other like relatives, listening to each other, and having a common goal. So I feel like we need to return to that. And Tashinka Whitco is right. Right now we're in a world that's sick. You know, I don't know how many school shootings that have occurred recently. I think I've lost count. And I feel like I'm speaking for myself, becoming desensitized to all these things that are happening. And those are not good things. And I feel like we need to reclaim some of these practices and heal our youth, and, you know, create a better future for our youth and really invest in them. And, you know, look at our organizations and examine them, and to see what is working and what is not working. So I'm going to end there with the presentation piece. So, and then I would like to see if anybody has any questions or comments. And I also want to say thank you for taking time to come to this session and for listening and sharing what you have to share too. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing.
You had a couple questions in the chat that I was able to grab that just moved so quickly because everybody's active and talking. So one of the first ones that came up was, is confidentially discussed or expected in this process, from Teresa.
So what is the question? I'm sorry.
I'll post them in the chat so you can see them as well as read them aloud. So the question was, is confidentially discussed or expected for this process? And I think it was the process of doing restorative healing.
Okay. Yes, as with any practice where sensitive information is disclosed and discussed, there's, there's confidentiality is expected, and that should really be part of the practice, part of the procedures, having everybody know that everything's going to be kept confidential, and what is discussed in the peacemaking process is to be kept there. And I remember when I was first learning about Navajo peacemaking, I watched a session where this young man was reluctant to share like what was going on. And it was because he said there's a certain relative that's here today who I know is going to go home and tell everybody what's been discussed here. So he's like, I don't really trust that person, and I don't want to disclose some of that. So just having all the parties involved know that what is discussed during the process will remain confidential. And really what is shared in the peacemaking process is to help the parties, and not to do further harm, not to re-traumatize those people. So having clear expectations for during the process for people who are participating. Okay, I see another question that says, that asks, do you see this working with Native adults with intergenerational conflict? And thank you for asking that question. That's a really good question to ask, because people who who are doing the work in their organization, they know their organization, they know their clients, their students, whomever they work with best. And if there is some conflict, you got to think about that. And that was part of the questions that I had raised earlier, is will these practices, are they appropriate for your program, for your school, for your organization? And then determine, since you know your organization best and you know your clients best, like thinking about that and coming to some kind of a, just coming to that answer. And then one of the questions that I see is it respectful to use Diné peacemaking or peacekeeping in an urban area? I think that that Diné peacemaking is a practice, again, thinking about your clients. Is it appropriate to use it in the area where you are with your clients? Will your clients be open to it? Or, just asking those questions, is your organization going to support it? Or is there going to be adequate training? Is it going to be well received? It's going to be practiced. So all those, thinking about if it's appropriate for your organization. But as a Diné who's lived in an urban area most of my adult life, I would say that it would be very appropriate to use with Diné and other people who are interested in this practice, because I lived in the Phoenix urban area for a long time, and there are a lot of Diné down in the Phoenix area, and they're always looking for something that's familiar with them, something that will work for them. So I feel like it would be appropriate to use in an urban area, as long as it's as long as it's understood, like the components, and that it's used in a very good way, and that that it's meant for that purpose, to achieve something. Okay, so there's another question that I see. So the legal system talks about recidivism a lot. Is this addressed differently in a restorative lens? Yeah, that's something that can be addressed with the peacemaking process. Like, is the person repeating some of the behaviors, or maybe it's a different incident, and then just really looking to see what's going on, and with that and looking at what else could be going on with that person, and really, you know, talking to them, getting to know them, it's establishing a good relationship with them, and then just talking like what's going on, um, and then restoring that person, because that's what we want, and we want them to stay in their community. But then there's also sometimes when something's just like a very violent and incident that happens that requires some more serious, it needs to be referred to the court systems. So sometimes that happens too. I've seen that addressed. So it really depends on the situation, on what's going on, and sometimes it just needs to be tried, and it needs to go to a different court, and maybe the peacemaking is not appropriate.
I just wanted to bring attention to all of the thank yous and appreciations that you're getting in the chat as well. I haven't seen any more questions in the chat, and if anyone would like to unmute and provide any further questions. Additionally, please look at messages either from myself or Eleanor, and I think Mariana or Erin have sent out a GIPRA link, and if you please complete that in the closing session, that would be wonderful. But with that, is there any further questions for Dr. Whitehead?
I don't have questions. I do have some musings, if I will. We have been well edified today, Dr. Whitehead. Thank you so very much for your time and your knowledge and your energy and the relatives that you bring into the space. I came to today's session really wanting to, really looking at how Navajo peacemaking, and particularly the presentation that you have, how it applies in a particular scope of youth mental health. And there's such a broad application, as you mentioned. It's important that for me, what I came away with is really these key concepts around healing, around balance, around respect, belonging, and how important those are, not only in a peacemaking process, but important for us individually, I feel like, and as well as important for the youth and Native youth that we work with. Thank you very much.
Dr. Whitehead, this is Martina Georges, and I want to thank you for, I'm sorry, I am a circle keeper for the Conex Indian tribe. They are Dinette, and I have been doing this work for since 2016. And I wanted to thank you for reminding me, because it's a constant learning, what to ask for, and those questions I've written down because I've forgotten them. And thank you so much for reminding me that. And I also wanted to echo, I think Robert, but we have an agreement with the state court here in Kenai, And we have a diversion program where the students who have minor consumings can come through our circle keeping to reduce their fee of 500 down to 50 if they complete successfully. I want to echo that when the kids come to do an intake with us and I'm talking to them, it is really good to watch how they react in the circle when they're included, and that they also are included in coming up with a plan. Their inclusion makes it so much more special because they also take responsibility, and they also come up with a plan. And so thank you. I really appreciate the knowledge that you shared with us and reminding us of what we need to consider.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate your comment, Yahet. And yes, I do want to thank everybody who joined us. And, hopefully my hope is that people come away, take away something, some kind of wisdom. And really, like, my whole goal is to improve like the well-being of Native youth. And so if there's any effort in this, any of this knowledge can be used to improve the lives of Native youth, that makes me happy. And I did, there was a question about if there's more information about, if there's training about like peacemaking and other practices. I put in the chat a link, and it's kind of like an international Indigenous Restorative Practices organization, and I did not check to see if it was active, and I believe they are, and they provide some information about various restorative practices. And I know that there's Navajo peacemaking has been researched and it's been documented, and I know that there's probably some training that occurs. And I went to their website, the Navajo Peacemaking, and there's a whole lot of information there too about the practice. And I know that there's practitioners that actually do this every day, and they provide trainings as well. And I'm not sure when those trainings happen, but I know that they do happening because it's an ongoing effort. And I do see a mention of the Honorable Robert Yazzie. He was instrumental and thankful that he wanted to bring back this practice to the Navajo Nation. And actually, it's been researched and it's been studied, and so many, by various researchers, and it's been shared, across the globe. So there's a lot of information out there about that. Again, thank you for your kindness, your kind words, and for being here.
All right, with that, we will bring this to a close.